to the fourth and final of these Lent Talks, which I've titled Prefer Nothing Whatever to Christ, Wisdom from the Monastic, something on living the baptized life. And in this final talk, our field of vision becomes closer to home as we look at the re-emergence of the religious life among Anglicans, taking as our time span 1841 to 2026. We have something here at St. Peter's which I think must almost certainly be unique, and that is one of the panels within the splendid Napier Waller stained glass window here in our south transept. This window is a war memorial, and it depicts a kaleidoscopic vision of salvation history, from the events of the Old Testament up until the 20th century. And the panel of which I am particularly speaking is that which shows the very moment when the religious life was reintroduced to the Church of England for the first time since the Reformation. You can't see the window from the pews, so I encourage you at some point, come to the chancel step and turn and look. It's in the window at the left edge in the middle panel, but I have reproduced it in your handout so you can see what it is that I'm speaking about. The scene is Trinity Sunday, 1841 in Oxford, when Marion Hughes, hereafter Sister Marion Hughes, made the vows of religion, that is, poverty, chastity, and obedience, privately before Dr. Edward Bouverie Pusey, and then went to the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin to receive the Eucharist from John Henry Newman, who was then the vicar of that church. In this quiet, almost unnoticed action taken by a young woman, supported by these two priests, the religious life was reborn in the Anglican world after having been extinguished at the Reformation 300 years before, when the monasteries were dissolved. The rebirth of the religious life is one of the most concrete and lasting gifts of the Oxford movement to the wider church. It puts into practice the theology developed by the Tractarians, especially concerning the unity and continuity of the Church Catholic. Because it is notable that Sister Marion is shown directly below the image of St. Hilda of Whitby. Unfortunately, St. Hilda's head and shoulders have been cut off in the printout. St. Hilda was a Benedictine nun and one of the truly towering figures in the English church in the 7th century. And she reminds us by her presence in the window that monastic men and women have played an enormous role in the history of the English church. The placement of these two women together reminds us that what happened in the 19th century was not novelty. It was a reawakened continuity with the ecclesial tradition. To this day, indeed, there are Anglican nuns at Whitby, living in a priory under the patronage of St. Hilda. We have Marion Hughes' diary entry from this fateful day, so I will allow her in her own words to tell us what she understood herself to be doing. This day, Trinity Sunday, 1841, was I enrolled one of Christ's virgins, espoused to him and made his handmaid, and may he of his infinite mercy grant that I may ever strive to please him, and to keep myself from the world though still in it, and should it be most mercifully granted that an opportunity may be given me to separate myself entirely from it, make me to rejoice in the means of taking the burden of his cross more closely to myself. And gracious Lord, give thy Holy Spirit to my dear parents, that they may receive this intelligence in a kind way, that if it be thy good pleasure, I may be spared the agony of perceiving their disapproval. But grant them health and peace for as many years as may be good for them in this life, and a joyful resurrection in the world to come, and be pleased to accept my service in remembrance of my dear mother's wonderful recovery, and to purify my heart from the sins of my childhood and youth, those that I have striven so long to hide from others, that they are now even hidden from my own memory. I beseech thee, blessed Jesus, everlasting God, Son of Holy Mary, look upon me with thy mercy, and let not my vow be a snare to me, but make it the means of drawing me to thee. I beseech thee also to bless thy holy ministers who have counselled me, and by their works led me to love thee. And here let me name them: Mr. Newman, Dr. Pusey, my spiritual advisor, Mr. Seeger and Mr. Bloxham, and I beseech thee, let me have the benefit of their prayers, and of all the glorious company of saints who had already been received into thy heavenly kingdom, and I beseech thee, grant this by virtue of thy blessed cross and passion, written by me in the 24th year of my life, at 12 o'clock at night, on my knees. This note is very touching, but it also bears witness to a mind that has already been well formed in the Catholic tradition, in her high view of the Church, in the communion of the saints, in the role of Our Lady and the efficacy of their prayers, and of the ability of a person to participate in the cross of Jesus, and of course, in the manner in which this day took place, of the utterly central role of the Eucharist in her faith and her life. We have here a very telling piece of text, and it is also evidence of the faith and courage of the woman who wrote it. Marian did not have an established community to join. She didn't have any other nuns or monks in her church to look to for guidance. She had taken a step which made her the only person in this way of life in her entire church. In a later diary entry, she describes that after taking her vows, she had had an experience of a mental darkness, a sense that she had cut herself off from all human ties, that she might be forever alone, but she made an act of faith, and the fear and the doubt passed away, never to return. Her fear is entirely understandable. It was eminently possible that no sisters would ever have joined her, that she might have been forever alone, a sister without any sisters to whom to belong. Marian's courage would have been admirable, whatever the outcome, and to this day, I really do think that we as her church owe her a debt of gratitude. And my one vexation with this window is that while Pusey is named, Marian is not. So while Marian was without sisters for the time being, she was certainly not without support. Her friends and advisors were those at the very heart of the Oxford movement, chief among them Pusey and Newman, and also her closest companions were the Reverend Charles Seeger and his wife, Tractarians in their own right, and dedicated to supporting her. 4 months after she took her vows, the Seegers accompanied Sister Marian to Normandy, where through a string of introductions in the French diocesan hierarchy, Marian was able to visit a number of communities of Catholic nuns, to meet them, to observe their way of life, and to be given a copy at least of the rule and constitution of the visitation order by the sisters at Caen, to help her prepare and plan for the governance of her own community. I only learned this recently about this visit, and the fact that this ecumenical friendship and generosity is baked into the very origins of Anglican religious life is, I think, eloquent and impressive. To this day, there is a level of ecumenical cooperation among religious which surpasses anything I've seen in the church at a regular diocesan level. Catholic and Anglican nuns and religious of other traditions understand that they are fundamentally the same sort of thing, and this understanding takes visible shape in friendship, support, mutual hospitality, and theological cooperation in academia and formation. So while Sister Marian was, for some time, the only Anglican in religious vows, she had plenty of reason to hope. She was encouraged by correspondence from Pusey and others that among both men and women, desire and interest were growing in the direction of committing themselves to God alone in this distinctive pattern of the religious life. Another factor Marian was facing was the opposition of her parents to her decision. And in In a minute or two, we'll talk about some of the reasons why Victorian parents were often far from pleased by the prospect of their daughters joining convents. In order to discharge what she understood was her religious duty to honour her parents, Marian stayed living with them until their deaths 8 years later, at which point she understood herself finally free to fully live out her vows. It was at this time that her order, taking the name of the Society of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, was able to come properly into being, living in quarters which are now part of St. Anthony's College in Oxford. And there's a funny timing quirk here where, while Marian was the first Anglican woman to become a religious, her community was not the first one to come into existence because of that 8 years waiting because of her parents. So by the time she and the 3 sisters who had chosen to join her started to live together, 4 other sisterhoods had already come into being in the intervening years. The Sisterhood of the Holy Cross next to Regent's Park in London, the Community of St. Mary the Virgin at Wantage in Berkshire, the Society of the Most Holy Trinity at Devonport, and the Nursing Sisters of St. John the Divine, which were first based out of King's College Hospital in London. And that order, as a sidebar, was the one to inspire the 15-year series Calls a Midwife, which brought Anglican religious life before the face of the viewing public and is now finished, so we need to find other ways of telling people that we exist. So these decades in the middle of the 19th century saw a great number of small, separate communities popping up around England, starting to experiment with how this way of life might look and work. Early on, these were primarily based around London and Oxford, but very soon further afield. Some were based out of parish churches. These were often smaller in scale and often didn't last quite so long as they relied on having a sympathetic and engaged parish priest, sympathetic to the cause, though some parish sisterhoods did survive to this day, including the All Saints Sisters of the Poor, born out of All Saints Margaret Street. Other orders were born by gathering around charismatic and determined leaders, either women who would go on to become foundresses, like Lydia Sellon, or priests who would help facilitate their life, such as Pusey himself or J.M. Neal, particularly. I always feel great fondness and admiration and a sense of excitement when I read about this period of growth and experimentation, these decades from the middle to the late 19th century. Experimentation is very much the right word. After 3 centuries of the religious life having been driven out of England, it had to be rediscovered from the ground up. The sisters did have books, especially liturgical and devotional books. They had some correspondence and occasional visits with Roman Catholic sisters, as we saw with Marian Hughes and her trip to France. And they had plenty of advice from their supportive clergymen, who of course knew no more than the sisters themselves, but were full of zeal and goodwill. 300 years, in one sense, is a very short time in church history, but in another sense, it's a very long time. When it comes to trying to revivify a way of life, it's long enough that everything really did have to start again. The written sources that the sisters had could only show a skeleton impression of what the life would look like. It wasn't fleshed out. There was not yet a way to apply it, let alone apply it to a 19th century context in a country that had forgotten what to do with nuns. So they worked it out. They experimented and observed and discussed and saw what worked and made adjustments. The tendency was to efforts that were so zealous and so ambitious as to sometimes come across as self-defeating and at the very least highly eccentric. We have a copy of the Aerarium, the daily schedule of the first sisters, the very first house at Park Village West next to Regent's Park, and I replicated that schedule in your handout because it is jaw-dropping. It is much stricter, much more demanding than what any Catholic sisters were attempting to live at the time. And I do want to salute the Herculean energy and dedication of these women. They were attempting to be everything at once, both contemplative and active, as they explored what it might mean to be a nun in the Church of England. So they were reciting very nearly the entire monastic office, the 8-fold services of liturgical prayer, which make up the lives of monastic houses, 8 of these offices a day in their oratory in the house, as well as going out to do works of charity and social service throughout the day, as they brought support to the impoverished families living in the slums of Camden Town and Somers Town. One of their first works in this vein was to set up a school for the local children as a pragmatic and highly demanding form of charitable work. On top of this already double load of work, they were also in their parish church twice every day, faithfully participating in the services of matins and evensong from the Book of Common Prayer, and taking the children from the school with them. This enormously demanding shape of life, accompanied by a strictness of observance including more than 100 days of fasting each year, did ultimately prove unsustainable, but I'm always surprised that they lived this shape for about a decade. And it grew and it thrived as they continued to discover what they were called to be. These particular sisters even had to move to a bigger premises. In 1852, 7 years after their first beginning, these sisters moved into the first purpose-built convent since the Reformation, designed by a promising-looking young architect by the name of William Butterfield, who waived his usual fees. 2 years later saw the outbreak of the Crimean War, and the superiors of of both the London house we've just been talking about and the community at Devonport, led by Lydia Sellon, decided to join forces with Florence Nightingale and also with half a dozen Roman Catholic Sisters of Mercy to go and nurse the war wounded. This project, by its very nature as a response to the outbreak of war, could not have been foreseen or planned, but it bore much good fruit, and it can in many ways be seen as the making of the Anglican religious life. It brought the sisters into contact and collaboration with the Catholic sisters, not just on paper or in occasional visits, but in daily shared life, able to share in their wisdom and experience. And it also brought them together with the figure of Nightingale herself, such a powerful and renowned character when it comes to the changing place of women's activity in the public sphere of Victorian Britain. I've included a few quotes from Nightingale's letters just before this period in the handout. And although it's not directly relevant in that she was not herself a sister, she gives a commanding sense of the social context. Nightingale condemned the Church of England's lack of provision for avenues of serious, meaningful work for women, work which she longed to give and which, in her case, by strength of character and determination, she did find other ways of expressing. The Church gave me neither work to do for her, Nightingale writes, nor education for it. That same note of claustrophobia and the thwarted desire to serve God and neighbour is heard in the writings and experience of many of the early sisters, especially those whose families intervened or attempted to stop them from joining communities. We know of many, many, many women who were delayed years and years from offering themselves as postulants because of their families' criticism and hesitation about the religious life, as Marian herself was. Among the All Saints sisters alone, whose records I looked at, one sister waited 11 years, one 18. Neither of these were seen as unusual. The ministry of the sisters during the Crimean War in the field hospitals, which were dirty and dangerous and risky, won the sisters a substantial measure of respect and gratitude and changed the place that they occupied in the social imagination, despite the barrage of criticism which was being circulated about them and which we'll hear more of momentarily. But this war effort showed their willingness to put their money where their mouth was, to be sacrificial and hardworking and devoted, and it made a huge difference in the perception of what they were doing. A word about the fact that we have been talking for the last 3 weeks about monastics, about people who stay home and pray all day, and we are now suddenly speaking about active or apostolic religious people who go out and work all day as well as praying all day. And it's not quite that simple. Because partly because, as we've seen, the Park Village sisters were keeping the full monastic observance as well as the active work they were doing. And while all the time that these houses were being dreamt up and planned and put into practice, monastic life was never far off the cards. As early as 1850, plans were being laid up to have such a life for the women who felt called to it, of enclosure and prayer, even by the Sisters of Mercy at Davenport, Lydia Selland's order, Marion Hughes' own sisters. Part of the experimentations that were being made among religious at this time was very much exploring the monastic and contemplative vocation, usually in the shape of having a wing or a branch or a particular house of an order that would be set aside for that way of life under the auspices of the active sisters. And this idea of a double order both has a very pragmatic element, but it also shows an admirable understanding of the underlying unity of the varied forms of the religious and monastic tradition, as always being a life of prayer which overflows into activity, rather than a life of activity which is supported by prayer, which is an observation A.M. Allchin made, I think, is characteristic of all Anglican orders. And in terms of orders specifically dedicated to the monastic life, the type we've been speaking about these last 3 weeks, these emerge slightly later. And one very beautiful instance of this is the case of West Malling Abbey in Kent. Malling was founded as a house of Benedictine nuns in the year 1090 and continued that way of life for almost 450 years until 1538, when the abbey was seized by the officers of Henry VIII and passed into secular ownership. Centuries later, in 1871, religious life returned to Malling when the last secular owners, who were an Anglo-Catholic family, gave use of part of the house to the community of the Sisters of the Church, who were using it to care for some orphans. And then there were a few years of somewhat complicated movements of property between hands, but in 1893, the first Benedictine community since the dissolution of the monasteries returned to Malling Abbey, singing, of course, a Te Deum as they processed through the gates. And to this day, Anglican Benedictine nuns live, pray, and work in that house as they have since the 11th century. The resilience of the call of the monastic life is told by that building alone. Moving forward slightly, the early 20th century saw the founding of two more still surviving monastic orders, the Sisters of the Love of God in Oxford in 1907 and the Society of the Sacred Cross in 1918, who began in Chichester and then moved to South Wales in 1921, and 100 years later I moved there. The question of religious orders for men within the Church of England, as distinct from the consideration of sisterhoods, was also very much part of the conversations in these decades. These considerations had a very different tone. They provoked less scandal and outrage. Rather than proposing, as the birth of a sisterhood does, that unmarried women leave their family homes and pursue this suspicious, independent way of life, the questions about male orders were often about envisaging how those who were already priests could best order their lives and their ministry. These were people who already had the right to exercise independence and autonomy, both in the church and the wider community. This vision is interesting, and it arose mostly out of the discoveries of the Tractarian movement, which set out a much more complete vision of the nature and duties of the priesthood, with which Anglo-Catholic clergymen now found themselves faced, in need of training and support, both spiritual and practical. And to meet these needs was the cause for which these first male communities were dreamt into being. And they were indeed attempted very early on by people such as Newman himself in the 1840s. The story of the most significant and enduring male order, that of the Society of St. John the Evangelist, often known as the Cowley Fathers, founded in 1866 by Richard Moe Benson, is worth telling, and he's a very evocative and skillful writer. I've put a couple of his books in the handout. It's an interesting story, and it's beyond the scope of what we can handle today, but there were these different forms of life with slightly different purposes and intentions working together and in constant communication. So now that we have, albeit at a gallop, something of a sense of the development of these communities, it's worth hearing about what the conversation was like about them within the church more broadly. We don't have time to give a full treatment of the arguments, which were drawn out for decades and decades and decades. I commend to you some reading, particularly Susan Mumm's book, but also other histories of the Victorian Church, which show the tenor of the debate, which was often extremely heated, aggressive, and hostile to the efforts these women were making and to the work of those who would support them. Their detractors imputed the worst possible motives, both to the women and particularly to the priests who were trying to facilitate their way of life. Religious and social arguments about sisterhoods cannot be sharply distinguished. Theology drawing, as it always does, on the experiences and insights and prejudices of the larger community from which the commentators are drawn. One of the reasons the debate was so hot was because it served often as a proxy for the larger enduring struggle between the evangelical and Anglo-Catholic wings of the church. One useful way of tracking the debates about religious life at this time, if you have hours and hours of time on your hands to read church documents, is by reading the reports of the church congresses, meetings which were held annually from 1861 onwards, representing a good spread of different parties and churchmanships. And the first congress to speak substantially to the question of sisterhoods was the second one, when Canon T.T. Carter, and Carter was in the minority because he was someone who was supportive of sisterhoods. He spoke in support of them in a way that defined the question, so it's useful to hear from him momentarily. He says that a sisterhood is a community of women living a single life in closest union with Christ and engaged in prayer or works of mercy. The first essential element of a sisterhood is the devotion to an abiding state of life according to the call of God on the soul. This is a useful definition because it has a focus on permanence and on a spiritual seriousness of vocation, of the call of God to the soul, as well as the visible part of engagement in a good Christian life of devotion and charity. These people he is discussing are without a doubt nuns. They're not deaconesses, they're not useful churchy ladies, they are nuns with the full set of existential implications, ecclesial politics, and painful historical memory which that reality invokes. Although the word nun, being scandalous, was often tidily hidden under the label sisterhoods, which out of respect to them I'm using today. And time again, the debates among leaders of the Church of England about religious life turns to the question of the vows, and whether vows in general, and religious vows in particular, are theologically admissible within the doctrinal framework of such a church. Nobody seemed able to come up with an answer. They spoke for decades and decades about this one question and all the different things that are going on within the one question. For to discuss vows is really to discuss the substance of the religious life and the concreteness of its existence as recognizably the same thing which existed in the English Church prior to the Reformation and continued to exist in the Roman Catholic Church. It is through the taking of the 3 vows of religion, as Marian Hughes did on that day in 1841, that the gift of the self to God and his church in a life of prayer and service is made real. We hear the controversy surrounding vows echoing even in that diary entry from Marian when she prays that her vows may not be a snare to her. So the objections of the church leadership to the sisterhoods is based not so much on what they were doing, grouping together while remaining single in order to pray and perform works of charity, but on their way of understanding and constituting themselves. It is significant to help understand that the extremely heated tone of the debate, that much of this is to be seen as part of the impulsive hostility against any perceived resemblance to Roman Catholicism at all. The anti-Catholic sentiment was a massively powerful social force, especially in this immediate wake of the re-establishment of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, which happened in 1850, so right in the middle of all this happening. I remember being taught while I was in the novitiate about the crosses that the early sisters would wear, where you would normally expect a crucifix. It was hinged, so a plain cross would be seen with the crucifix hidden inside, because crucifixes themselves were so upsettingly Catholic visually. Everything had to be thought out about protecting from this anti-Catholic vitriol. However, even past this anti-Catholic knee-jerk reaction, there are other theological questions that are active other than the suspicion of popery. One of these is to do with authority and who possesses it. Vows are not made to the abbess, they are made to God in the presence of the community, but they are received by her as the superior. This raises the question of who has the power to release a woman from these vows if she should choose to leave the community. And to this day, requests for dispensation from life vows must cross the desk of the Archbishop of Canterbury. This took a long, long time to figure out. Furthermore, the very act of making a vow presupposes one's rights over oneself. It's an act of independence, ironically enough, to vow obedience to poverty, chastity, and obedience, poverty, and chastity. The more supposedly theological objection was that old accusation of works righteousness, picking up on the continental reformers' argument, the idea that taking a vow was a man-made tradition to try to earn salvation or the favor of God. This is clearly a nonsense to anyone with even a glancing familiarity with monastic theology, and it's never tellingly applied to the marriage vow, which is always seen as permissible. Vows were framed by hostile outsiders as a means for unscrupulous priests to trap the women who entered religious houses. To give a sense of how heightened and ugly this debate became, I quote here from a committee of inquiry into convents, i.e. an official church body, from the inquiry that was made, and I apologize before I read this for both its sanctimony and its salaciousness. Thus, a girl who is just growing into womanhood and is at an age when her mind is most easily deceived and she does not understand the cravings and instincts of woman's nature or of a woman's heart, is called upon to take the last vows, and then the monks and priests possess her for life. Her afterlife is a secret and mystery to the outer world. Every crime known to earth and hell may be perpetuated. There may be the cry of insulted innocence. There may be the shriek of outraged virtue. It may ring and ring again through the walls and never reach the outside world. This quote is representative, sadly enough, of much of both the content and the tone of the opposition to the sisterhoods. There was a vast pamphlet warfare, is Susan Mumm's word for it, and there were also horrible cartoons that were drawn to cast slander on the sisters and the priests who supported them, and endless pamphlets and public talks and lectures being given. So the hostility did mainly take place in words, but did occasionally break into physical violence. A school run by a sisterhood in Norwich was attacked in the 1860s by a mob which smashed the windows and rushed at the doors. But returning to this vexed matter of vows, some bishops, as a halfway measure, permitted for a time the taking of vows for limited periods, a few years, then to be renewed over and again at intervals, rather than the lifelong gift of self which traditionally marks the complete entrance of a sister into religion. To eschew this permanence in favour of renewable temporary vows robs the religious of the experience of stability which is so intrinsic to the monastic life. In 1883, a priest familiar with the dynamic of religious orders spoke against this compromise. He wrote, "As to terminable vows, I speak with some experience when I say that they are a great failure. They produce a revolutionary crisis in a sister's life every 3 or 5 years. He understood that vows are an existential matter." While the question about authority related particularly to the vows of obedience and poverty, another set of concerns was also brought about by the vow of celibacy entered into permanently for life, and the real fear that it would lead to the state of marriage being held in lower regard and the great threat to the social order and the well-being of the family that this would lead to. And while it would be hard to deny that the idea of marriage is indeed held in less esteem than it was in previous centuries, I don't really think we can lay the blame in any serious manner at the feet of Anglican nuns. On one hand, these theoretical debates between bishops and theologians had little direct impact on the lives of the sisters who were getting on with their work and their prayer, except when they did, particularly when communities set up new houses responding to social needs within the boundaries of parishes with incumbents who were hostile. Typical of this kind of open hostility was the response of a fervently evangelical vicar in East Grinstead when informed that the town's new sisterhood, the Society of St. Margaret, was to be a nursing order. He said, "The first case of infectious fever I have, I will ask them to undertake, and then perhaps we shall get rid of them." Priests in this position could best undermine the sisters and seek to destroy their ability to stay and do their work by using their spiritual and social influence to ruin their reputation through the quiet but extremely effective weapons of gossip and innuendo. This particular anxiety about marriage and the women who were choosing not to pursue it was expressed more fully and more viciously in the discourse outside of the official forums of the church, and it was not limited to religious grounds. And one of the most useful and illuminating books about this period, full of primary sources, is Susan Mumm's Stolen Daughters, Virgin Mothers, detailing the social context within and against these women were acting. There is much more to say than we can cover today, but there are a few key notes that sound through this picture of the social framework. There was a real dread of the family unit, which was so sacrosanct to the Victorians, being invaded and undermined by alien forces, especially such un-English presences as priests and nuns. And you can imagine from what we've heard above the degrading and perverse accusations that were made in the pamphlets that were circulating. There was also a great anxiety about money, a constant stream of accusing priests and mothers superior of targeting naive, wealthy young women, asking them to join their orders as a way of laying hands on their inheritance. In an age when the ideal of the angel in the house dictated to give the best vision of the woman in her social role as being fundamentally domestic, particularly for middle-class British women, almost everything about the religious life was seen as a threat. Susan Mumm sums it up well when she says, "The essential problem was this. Sisters did not accept the Victorian ideas of what women should be, want, and do. They chose to work when most of them could have lived in comfortable idleness. They chose to remain single in a culture which saw single women as failures. They chose to expose themselves to scenes and experiences commonly regarded as unfit for ladies. They chose to separate themselves from their families, and they chose to experiment with a women-centered lifestyle which was at this time wholly foreign to the British way of thinking." This was the context in which these women were operating, and yet they kept on, they worked and they prayed and they grew. And through their steady witness, especially in circumstances where others would not go, such as nursing in the Crimean field hospitals, such as working with people living in slums, working with prostitutes, through this work which no one else was willing to do, the sisters came to win the trust of the public, even if in the corridors of power of the church, the debate was still crackling away. I'd like now for us to gallop from the 19th to the 21st century and ask how things stand now for our Anglican religious orders. There's this line that's often used, attributed to different people, saying that religious orders are the best kept secret in the Anglican Church, and sadly it's quite true. Conversations about Anglican religious life always have to begin by declaring that it exists at all, and furthermore, that it still exists. I once had the rather uncanny experience of having to argue that I, an Anglican nun at the time, was alive and well in the face of someone who was insisting that I wasn't. I was on campus visiting a friend at the University of Melbourne, wearing a habit, and a stranger approached me to tell me happily about her experience of having been taught in school by Anglican sisters and how very sad she was that they didn't exist anymore. So I shared the happy news that, in fact, they still did, but she kept sighing sadly and repeating, "No, no, you've all died off." It's quite hard to argue against that. So I bring you and her happy news. The nuns, monks, sisters, and friars of the Anglican churches have not, in fact, died off. In the words of Mark Twain, the reports of their death have been greatly exaggerated. With rather providential timing, an article came out in the Church Times last week, I think on Thursday, interviewing a number of novices in Anglican religious orders and also supplying some figures. Because it's all still going on, year after year, people, just as Marion Hughes did, are making their own experimentation and discovery, tasting the religious life by entering as postulants. It's a good article. It gives a chance to hear from some of them and reports on the encouraging trends which seems to suggest even more of an appetite for this life post-pandemic, with more and younger people inquiring about joining. The article provides some numbers, but I never trust these numbers because every nun I've ever spoken to and asked how many sisters she has runs through their names in their heads and counts them on her fingers, and I don't trust these people to be able to get reliable numbers. But according to the Church Times, across the 30 communities in the UK, 217 people are living as Anglican religious, 158 women and 59 men, and I would not stake any money on those numbers, but it's a reminder that this is still going on. People are still coming and going in this life. For a fuller picture than these numbers can be about the current state of these orders, I commend to you two different websites that I've mentioned in your handout. One is the Anglican Religious Life Yearbook, and the other is the Anglican Religious Life Project, And each of these websites has information about the various orders, and also articles and interviews and reflections offered by some of the sisters and brothers to fill out more of a picture of what the life looks like now than anything that I can give today. Somewhat amusingly, if you have my exact sense of humour anyway, the Church of England did finally come around to making a formal legal recognition of its religious orders when its General Synod approved an amendment to Canon 40, which runs to 4 pages describing their role within their church and their requirements from the hierarchy. Beginning what I think is a fairly good summary, the Church of England affirms that since the time of the early church, there have been Christian people who, in response to God's call, have committed their whole lives to God in the religious life, a radical commitment shaped by the evangelical counsels, marked by consecrated celibacy, poverty and obedience, and fulfilled as a member of a community where the religious life is lived in common or as a solitary, and that at various times other Christian people have responded to the same call, fulfilling their baptismal promises through particular forms of public commitment and of accountability in obedience to Christ. This legal recognition was not made in the 19th century when the debate was raging. It wasn't made in the 20th century. It's from 2019. It is 178 years after Marian Hughes took her vows. I made a quick search of the canons of the Anglican Church of Australia, and I could find no reference to religious orders at all, but it may be a failure in my search. Leading on from that, as we look back at this romp through the history of the Anglican religious life and its current state of affairs, I think it's worth thinking about what we can take away from examining them and the way in which the Church has received them. I think the words of Pusey are relevant here. He who was so central to the rebirth of the religious life in the English Church. He made this comment in 1848, describing what he was seeing happen around him. The striking characteristic of the history, and that which makes it, and so much besides, that has been hopeful of late years in the Church of England, the more to be God's work, has been the very absence of design. It was not planned by man. It originated in the providential leadings of God. He began, he carried it on, he gave strength, he will give the increase. It was not the work even of thoughtful persons, judging a priori that such institutions would be a blessing to the English Church. It was not planned, it grew. This point is a critical one. I've spent much of this talk dwelling on the hostility and difficulties faced by the early communities, and this wasn't just to revel in the unpleasant, but to note and commend the ways in which this tradition has developed. It was not planned, as Pusey said. It was not imposed from above. It was not dreamed up in meetings of synod, but it was discovered by the attempts of faithful women and men to respond to the call of God on their lives, by women and men who were trying to do what was both very old and very new in the situations in which they found themselves. It is born out of a profound and impressive trust in the mission of God and of the mission of his church. It understands that the church indeed is wiser, older, and kinder than any specific instances of ecclesial leadership they saw before them. This model of faithfulness and generosity in the face of misunderstanding, ignorance, and suspicion, which is not entirely extinct even today, can be an encouragement for any of us who might ever feel weary or disillusioned with elements of the structures of the church within which we live and move and have our being. The religious orders don't pretend to offer a parallel alternative to the diocesan and parochial church, but they do offer something alongside it, complementing it, something into which all people can tap. We all have the opportunity to enter a place where it is never in doubt that the priority is always given to prayer and to sharing life with others. This is the gift which religious orders hold out to all of us. and whether we make use of that gift simply by our knowledge of its existence, or whether we become oblates, or make retreats, or make friends with religious, or read the books they write. Whichever way we engage, a certain space is held open for all of us by the faithfulness of the sisters and brothers of our church. One nun I know uses a particular metaphor to describe the role of Anglican religious within the wider church, and it is quite sentimental, but as it's the last of these sessions, I thought I'd break it out. She compares the nun to the sanctuary lamp in a church, which burns as long as the Blessed Sacrament is present. Her life is something that has been set apart for the sole purpose of being near to Jesus and of gently drawing other people's attention to the fact that he is present and has a claim on us. There is so much that could be said about this life in history and today. Today's talk has been only a little sample, a couple of key moments, a gesture towards some of the social and theological pressures, a snapshot of these orders. But if you take something away, beyond merely the knowledge of these orders' existence, which is point number one, I hope it's an appreciation of their bravery, their faith, and their determination, their conviction that God has called them to serve him in this way, to be a witness, to hold open a space where prayer and the shared life is of tantamount importance. From Sister Marion Hughes in 1841 to this very week, when on Wednesday in England, yet another sister will follow Marion's footsteps and profess her own vows. These women and men stake everything to follow and serve the God they love, and to remind us that we can as well, in our own ways, in the places where we find ourselves, as we discover afresh how to respond to Christ's call to turn to him and to prefer nothing whatever to him. If there are any questions that people have, I'm happy to try to answer them either here or at the door, which seems to be a more comfortable discussion place for some. But thank you very much for coming along to these talks. It's been a pleasure.